The night Kale ran, he did not look back. He had learned that lesson early, the same lesson every child born under the Veth occupation learned, usually once, usually painfully. You did not look back, not at the smoke rising from the grain silos, not at the soldiers in their pale environmental suits sweeping through the market with their resonance rods, not at your mother standing in the doorway of the house you would never enter again, her hand raised not in farewell but in warning, fingers spread flat. Go, just go. He ran through the dark. The outer fields of Westhold smelled like turned earth and old rain, and the boy who was 17 and had not slept in 2 days moved through them the way water moves through stone, not fast, but unstoppable, finding every crack and shadow that the Veth flood lamps couldn't reach. He was not large. He was not particularly fast. What he was stubborn in the specific, unremarkable way of people who have simply run out of better options. He had a canteen, half full, a folded cloth with some dried root in it, a pair of boots that were someone else's and slightly too wide, which he'd stuffed with rags at the toes to compensate. He had no weapons because weapons were processed out of the settlements every 3 months on a rotating schedule, and Westhold's schedule had fallen 2 weeks ago, and the Veth were thorough. Behind him, somewhere past the tree line, he heard the low cycling hum of a Veth atmosphere scanner. They swept the settlement perimeters every 4 hours now. The overseer had increased the frequency after someone had scrawled a word on the wall of the processing center. One word, in old script, the kind of script the Veth had declared illegal to teach, but which the children of Westhold had been learning in basements and root cellars for 11 years regardless. King. Kale hadn't written it, he didn't know who had. He knew whose handwriting it wasn't, which was all he'd been able to confirm before the summons came, a processing order in his name, with the specific numbering pattern that meant you would go to the administrative center and you would not come back as yourself, or at all. He crossed the outer marker ditch and kept moving east. There were places between settlements, old places, where the Veth hadn't bothered to plant their scanner towers yet. The occupation was 11 years old, and the conquerors were efficient, but they were not omniscient, which was a thing the people who kept careful track of such things had noted and catalogued and preserved in the same spirit as you preserve anything precious under difficult conditions. Quietly, without drawing attention, with the specific patience of a species that had spent its entire existence adapting to conditions it hadn't chosen and refused to stop anyway. The Veth had taken Earth fast, faster than anyone had believed possible, because human governments had simply never encountered a species that communicated through synchronized neural broadcast, that moved its military assets like a single distributed organism, that experienced individual death as merely a minor inconvenience to a shared consciousness. Humanity had fought the way it always fought, in separate, brilliant, uncoordinated bursts. The Veth had fought the way a flood fights a series of small fires. But 11 years was a long time, and the Veth had made, in the estimation of the people who still kept track of such things, one significant error. They had not destroyed the crown. The boy arrived in Cairnholm 2 mornings later, hungry and mud-streaked, with a blister on his left heel the size of a coin and eyes that had not fully closed in the interval. He had spent the first night sheltering in an agricultural drainage tunnel he'd found by following the slight depression in the terrain, a thing his mother had taught him years ago, before the occupation had reduced her to doorways and warnings. You read the land, she'd said. The land remembers what it was before they came. The land had not forgotten. He'd slept 4 hours in the tunnel, woken to the dawn scan hum at precisely 4 hours 12 minutes and moved on. Cairnholm was not on any Veth administrative map. It existed in the valley between 2 scanner dead zones, a fact its inhabitants had discovered by careful, methodical, decades-long effort, and they protected the knowledge of it with the particular ferocity of people who know they have exactly one thing left to lose. An old woman met him at the perimeter, not because anyone had expected him specifically, but because someone always met newcomers at the perimeter. They rotated the duty. Right now, it fell to a woman named Sella, who had been a municipal water engineer before the occupation, and who carried herself with the precise, unimpressed bearing of someone accustomed to making large systems work whether they wanted to or not. She looked at him for a long moment. He was still breathing slightly hard from the last mile of slope. She looked at the boots, noting the rags visible at the toe box, and at the state of his hands and at his eyes, and at the specific quality of someone who has been running for 2 days. "Who sent you?" she said. "Nobody sent me." "Who told you we were here?" "My mother before." He did not elaborate on before, he didn't need to. Sella studied him a moment longer. She had the habit of completing her assessment before she spoke, which other people often mistook for coldness, and which was actually a form of respect for the information she was receiving. Then she turned and walked toward the valley without further comment. Cale followed. It was, he would later understand, the closest thing Cairnholm offered to a welcome. The settlement was built into the hillside, mostly underground, partly in the old root cellars of a farming estate that had burned in the first year of the occupation. There were perhaps 200 people here, which was remarkable given that the Veth processed known settlement populations every 6 months, and they had managed to stay hidden for 9 years, which was more remarkable, and they had done both things not through any particular heroism but through collective discipline, and the kind of patient, grinding, unglamorous competence that the Veth seemed constitutionally incapable of modeling. The problem with the Veth, and it was a problem from their perspective, was that they understood collective action and they understood hierarchy, but they had no framework for understanding a community that was neither. They expected resistance to look like organization. Cairnholm was not organized in any way a Veth scanner was calibrated to detect. It was adaptive. It was distributed. It had no center, no single point of failure, no command structure that could be cut. It had Sella, who made decisions about water systems, and a man named Porus, who made decisions about food allocation, and 17 other people who made decisions about 17 other things, and they coordinated through the same mechanism that communities have always used to coordinate when formal authority is unavailable. A shared understanding of what mattered, maintained through the slow accumulation of trust. Cale spent his first week doing what newcomers always did: labor in exchange for food and lodging, the lowest value tasks, roof sealing and water hauling, and the careful maintenance of the perimeter camouflage nets. He did not complain. He was not by temperament a complainer. He was by temperament someone who watched. He watched the settlement's rhythms. The way the scanner hum governed everything: meals timed around dead windows, movement patterns that never coincided with the 4-hour sweep cycles, conversations that paused and resumed and paused again in unconscious deference to the passing sound above. He watched the children, who had been born here, and for whom this was simply the shape of the world, moving through it with an unself-consciousness that the adults had almost but never entirely recovered. He watched Sella, who spent her evenings with hand-drawn schematics of the valley's water table, updating them obsessively, always updating them. He noticed on his 3rd day that there was a room in the deepest part of the root cellar complex that no one went into. Not avoided, exactly. Not forbidden by any spoken rule. But no one went there the same way no one discusses a scar they've had for so long they've stopped seeing it. The avoidance was old enough to have become unconscious. He noticed on his 5th day that Sella went in twice, briefly, and came out looking the way people look when they've just finished an argument with themselves. He noticed on his 6th day that a sound sometimes came from behind the door. Music, not full pieces, just fragments, a phrase repeated, stopped, repeated again. The quality of practice, not performance. On his 7th day, he asked about it. He asked one of the younger residents, a girl named Marin who was 2 years older than him and had been born in Cairnholm, and had therefore never known a world without the occupation, which gave her a certain clarity about it that the adults who remembered before often couldn't quite sustain. The ones who remembered before spent energy on the gap between then and now that Marin simply didn't have. It had made her, in Cale's assessment, very efficient. "What's in the basement room?" he said. "The deep one where nobody goes." They were repairing one of the camouflage nets together, threading new polymer cord through the frame weave, and Marin kept working as she answered, which he'd noticed she did when she was thinking carefully about something. "The crown," she said. He looked up. "And Esther," she added, "who touched it?" He'd heard of the crown, of course. Everyone had heard of it, though the Veth had spent considerable resources trying to ensure they hadn't. It was the kind of history that travels in whispers, passed between parents and children in the dark, repeated in the spaces between scanner sweeps, preserved with the same instinct that made people preserve language and music and the old scripts, not because it was useful immediately, but because it was true, and truth had a different survival coefficient than usefulness. The last human king, not a king in the old political sense, but in the sense that mattered, the sense of sovereignty, had worn it on the day the Veth fleet entered Earth's atmosphere and the combined military of the human race scrambled to respond. It was not a symbol. It was technology. Old technology, older than the governments that had been arguing about it for decades, older than the international bodies that had filed 17 different committee reports about its ethics and its risks and its potential for misuse, and had ultimately, in the tradition of international bodies everywhere, done nothing. The crown was a neural amplifier, not a weapon, not a defense system. Something more fundamental, a way of allowing a single human mind to synchronize with many human minds simultaneously, to broadcast intention and receive sensation across distance, to function as a single conscious node in a network that could, in theory, encompass the entire species. The Veth communicated through synchronized neural broadcast. They had evolved it over millions of years. They had built their empire on it. When they encountered the crown in their initial scans of Earth's military infrastructure, they understood immediately what it was. They understood it, in fact, better than humanity did. They declared it cursed. They said this loudly and publicly, through their occupation broadcasts, in the first weeks after the fall. They said it in every language, and they had studied human languages with remarkable thoroughness, because understanding a species you planned to occupy required understanding how it communicated, which meant understanding what it feared. Any human who touches the crown will be destroyed. The crown is a sealed artifact of the old war, charged with energies that will kill any organic who contacts it. Do not approach it. Do not seek it. It is preserved as a warning. They did not destroy it. They left it exactly where it had been found, in a vault beneath the ruins of what had been, briefly, a unified command center. A place that humans had built in the desperate last weeks before the fall, trying to solve in 3 weeks the coordination problem they had failed to solve in 3 decades. They put guards on the building, but not inside it. They constructed their warning broadcasts. They waited for humanity's deep and well-documented instinct toward superstition to do the rest. For 11 years it worked. The person who had touched the crown 8 years ago was a woman named Esther. She had been traveling between settlements, carrying information the way people carried information when the communications networks were gone, in her head, on her body, through the walking of distance. And she had passed through the area of Torrens Station where the vault was, and she had heard the same whispers, and she had done what people sometimes do when they have been living inside someone else's fear long enough. She had decided to verify it. She had come back. That was the thing people remembered about it. She had come back, not destroyed, not killed, but wrong somehow in a way that was hard to describe and harder to witness. She played music with one hand. She had been a musician before, violin, and half her face was changed, the tissue altered, the eye above it glassy and still, and she sat in the corner room and said little, and the people of Cairnholm who had absorbed her when she arrived and who were in the business of absorbing difficulty, had built a life around her presence the way a tree builds around a wire. The room where nobody went was the room where Esther lived. Cale went to see her the next morning. He went early, before the settlement's rhythm fully woke, down the stairs in the blue-gray light that made it to the deep cellars through a network of light pipes someone had installed 20 years ago. The door to the deep room was wooden, old wood, the original cellar door. He knocked because it seemed like the right thing to do. "It's open," Esther said. She was sitting in the corner, as he'd expected. She was perhaps 40, though she looked both older and younger than that in different ways, the way people sometimes do when something fundamental has shifted in them. The left side of her face was changed, not destroyed, not melted but restructured, the tissue arranged into patterns that were not quite human and not quite not, like a language being translated imperfectly, the meaning preserved but the grammar alien. Her left eye was open and very still. Her right eye tracked him as he came in. She had a violin on her lap, loosely held. She had apparently just stopped playing. He sat down across from her and was direct, because being anything else seemed disrespectful. "I want to know what it does," he said. "Not what happened to you, what it does." The distinction mattered. Something in her right eye acknowledged that it mattered. "It connects," she said. Her voice was entirely normal. That was the thing that caught people off guard, he suspected, the complete normality of her voice. "That is all it does. You touch it and it reaches every mind in range, every human mind. You feel them, all of them at once." "At once," he repeated. "At once, not sequentially, not one at a time. The full spectrum simultaneously, like." She paused, searching. "You know how you can hear a piece of music and the chord is not one note but all the notes together? It was like that. But the notes were people. And you lost control of it." "I held on," she said. "There was no self-pity in it, only accuracy. I was a musician. When I felt it open, I wanted to hear all of it. I held on past the point where I should have let go. It rewrote some things." She touched the changed side of her face with the back of her fingers, unhurried. "The connection is still there, partly, like a nerve that never quite healed." "Is it? Does it hurt?" "It's unusual," she said. "It's not pain, it's presence. I'm always slightly aware that there are other minds, very faintly, like knowing there are stars even in daylight. You can't see them, but they're there." Cale sat with this. Outside in the corridor, a water pipe knocked softly, twice, someone drawing morning water. "The Veth declared it cursed," he said, "immediately. In the first weeks." "Yes. They understand what it does." "Oh," Esther said, and there was something in the quality of that syllable, almost dry, almost amused, filtered through years of sitting with an enormous thing quietly. "The Veth understand exactly what it does. Better than any human did when we built it. That is precisely why they called it cursed." She looked at him with her right eye, the one that moved. "The Veth are a distributed consciousness. Every Veth thinks as part of a network. They have no concept of individual, will sustaining itself inside a collective. What terrifies them, and it does terrify them, I felt this when the connection opened, I felt their fear, it was one of the clearest signals I received, is a species that can achieve synchrony without surrendering individuality. The Veth broadcast, but every Veth in the broadcast thinks the same thing. We would still think our own thoughts. We would just think them together, briefly, by choice." Cale leaned forward slightly, without realizing he had. "And that's enough," he said. "More than enough. They are a species whose military, logistics, communication, and governance all operate through neural network synchrony. If the network fragments, even temporarily, even partially, they are not a coordinated empire. They are several million confused individuals who have never, in their entire evolutionary history, been required to make a single decision alone." "The relay towers," Cale said. "It was not a question, it was the shape of a plan arriving." The relay towers, Esther said. They use them to maintain synchrony across distances that would otherwise fragment the neural broadcast. Without the towers, the Veth on Earth lose contact with the broader network, and then she stopped. And then they're alone, he said, in their own heads. Which is, she said quietly, the only thing they have ever been genuinely afraid of. He told Sela that evening. He told her in her workspace, among the water table schematics, while the settlement went about its dinner preparations in the corridor outside. He told her plainly and without asking permission, and with the particular calm of someone who has made a decision and is now simply informing the relevant parties. Sela listened. She received information the way she received all complex inputs, completely, without interruption, without the premature narrowing of attention that comes from starting to respond before you've finished hearing. When he finished, she said, "The vault is 3 days' travel." "I know." "Guarded." "Lightly." The Veth don't guard what they've convinced everyone is fatal to approach. That's the argument you want to make about a place that damaged Esther's mind permanently. "Esther held on too long," he said. "She told me herself. She wanted to feel all of it. I don't want to feel it. I want to send one thing." "What thing?" He had been working on the answer to this. He had thought about it through the previous night and this morning and the afternoon's work, and he had the answer the way you have the answer when you've been honest with yourself about what you can and cannot do. "A direction," he said. "A signal. Not words, not a plan, something simple enough that it doesn't need to be translated. An impulse toward the relay towers, the location of everyone in network range. Every person who receives it will know where the towers are. Some of them will be in a position to do something about it. Not all of them, not most of them, but enough. You only need enough." Sela was quiet for a long time. Outside the scanner hum came and went right on schedule. 4 hours, 14 minutes. The predictability of it so total that Kale had been timing it unconsciously for the last week. "You're describing a human species-wide coordinated action," she said, "without any communications infrastructure, without any advanced planning, without anyone knowing it was coming." "Yes." "The Veth have been studying human behavior for 11 years. They have models of every resistance pattern we've attempted." "You're proposing something we've never attempted." "I'm proposing something we've never attempted because we've never had the capacity," Kale said. "We do now. We always did. They took it away from us by convincing us we didn't." Sela looked at him. Then she looked at the water table schematics on the table between them as if they might have an opinion. Then she said, "If you're wrong, you don't come back from that vault." "If I'm right," he said, "they don't." They sent 4 people with him. Sela made that decision the following morning without discussion, which meant she had been thinking about it all night and had arrived at a conclusion. The 4 were a man named Goris, who had been a structural engineer and who knew the architecture of the vault building from memory, having once been assigned to an assessment team in the early occupation years. A woman named Tev, who had grown up within 10 kilometers of Torrance Station and knew the terrain. A young man named Petin, who had, in a previous life, been a communications technician and who understood the Veth relay tower frequencies better than anyone in Cairnholm. And Marin, who announced she was coming with a flat certainty that nobody quite felt equal to arguing with. "I've never been outside the valley," Marin said to Kale the evening before they left. "I've lived here my whole life. I was born after the fall." She said this without complaint, the same way she said everything as an accurate statement of fact. "I want to see what I'm doing this for." "You might not like what you see," he said. "I've seen enough of what's here," she said. "I'd like to see what's beyond it." They left before dawn, moving in the dead window between scanner sweeps, equipped with the camouflage knowledge and terrain familiarity that 9 years of careful observation had accumulated. They moved at night and sheltered in the day, in drainage tunnels and old barn foundations, and on the second night in the collapsed basement of what had once been a school, where someone had written, in pencil on the wall, the names of what appeared to be 30 or so children, a class roster, preserved because no one had had a reason to erase it. Marin stood in front of it for a while, with her lamp shielded to the minimum. "Do you think any of them?" she started. "Some of them," Cale said. It was the honest answer. "Definitely some." They moved on at the next dead window. On the third morning before dawn, they reached Torrance Station. The building that contained the vault was easy to identify because the Veth had half dismantled and half retrofitted it in a way that left its human origins visible. The original stone foundation showing through the Veth's smooth pale, prefabricated administrative additions like bones through skin. The old windows sealed with alien material, but still recognizable as windows. The entrance path rerouted but still traceable in the slight depression of the ground where human feet had worn it over years. There were 3 Veth guards on the exterior, in the standard pale environmental suits, carrying resonance rods and the short-range neural broadcast emitters they used for communication. They stood with the patient, slightly unfocused stillness of entities that experience guard duty as a distributed function. They were not bored, because boredom requires a self that is present and separate, and they were not individually alert, but the network of which they were nodes maintained a continuous ambient awareness that had, for 11 years, been more than sufficient. Goris confirmed the maintenance corridor was where his assessment records showed. It had been classified as a structural hazard by the Veth survey teams, partially collapsed, too narrow for practical use, assessed as non-priority. Which was accurate, from the perspective of a species that communicated through neural broadcast and had no single agent small enough and flexible enough and stubborn enough to navigate it alone. Cale stripped his pack down to nothing. He went in. The corridor was tight and dark and smelled of old stone and something faintly chemical. The Veth's environmental modification compounds, residual from the early occupation, when they had adjusted Earth's atmospheric chemistry slightly to better suit their biology. He moved through it on his hands and knees in places, through settled dust that had been undisturbed for years. The dust was calm. The dust did not care about any of this, which he found obscurely reassuring. He found the vault door from the inside. It was not locked. Of course it was not locked. Locks communicated that someone might want to enter. The Veth security model here was entirely psychological. The guards outside for visible deterrence, the broadcast warnings for psychological deterrence, and the absence of any physical barrier inside because physical barriers would have implied the need for them, would have suggested that the crown was something worth protecting rather than something worth avoiding. The door opened on a simple lever. It opened without resistance, and Cale stepped through. The vault was a small room. He had expected something more imposing. What he found was the kind of room that housed things which have been waiting for a long time, not dramatic, not theatrical, just present. Stone walls, cold air. A single light source from above that might have been natural, or might have been an old fixture still drawing power from somewhere. It didn't matter which. In the center of the room, a glass and steel case, museum quality or near enough. The kind of case that says, "Look but do not touch." The glass was unbroken. The latch was a simple mechanism. The crown was in 3 pieces inside it. He'd known it was broken. The name told him that, the history told him that. It had been broken in the last days before the fall when the person wearing it had fallen, and the fall had fractured it, and there had not been time to repair it before everything else demanded all available attention. Knowing it was broken and seeing it were different. It was not impressive in the way he'd been half expecting it to be. It was not large. It was made of a dark alloy that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, with circuitry inlaid in patterns too precise and too regular to be decorative, functional, clearly functional, the kind of aesthetic that emerges from engineering rather than artistry. The 3 pieces sat in their foam cutouts in the arrangement they would form if assembled, and they sat with the quiet non-drama of a thing that simply is what it is. He stood in front of the case for a while, not afraid, not brave exactly, just present, letting himself be here in this room with this thing, in this moment that was either going to matter enormously or was going to be the last moment of his making rational decisions. He thought about Esther, about what she'd said. She had held on too long because she'd wanted the full chord. She was a musician and she had reached for the full chord, and the full chord had been too much. He didn't need the full chord. He needed to send one note and then let go. He opened the case. He reached in. He picked up the crown. What happened when his hands closed around it was not dramatic in the way of physical phenomena. There was no light, no sound, no surge of visible energy. What happened was purely internal, and it was total. Every human mind in range. He had expected something like a flood. What he got was more like a key fitting a lock, a clean, total engagement, the sensation of a circuit completing, of a connection that had been waiting so long for this specific configuration that it simply opened without friction. And what came through was not chaos. It was humanity. Millions of them, arranged by distance, an expanding sphere of consciousness, each one distinct, each one undeniably itself, each one simultaneously contributing to a texture that was not noise but was the specific texture of human experience at this particular moment in history under these particular circumstances. He felt fear, the specific, chronic, managed fear of people who had been afraid for a long time and had developed a complex relationship with the sensation. He felt endurance. He felt the small jokes that people make under impossible conditions, because humor is the mind's way of insisting on its own survival. He felt music playing in someone's head in Sao Paulo, a tune their mother had sung, playing on a loop while they went about their labor assignment. He felt a man in Osaka concentrating on a machine with the pure absorbed pleasure of someone doing exactly the thing they're good at. And in that concentration, there was something that felt like defiance, even though the man himself might not have named it that. He felt an old man in what had once been London lying in a hospital bed with dark glasses over his eyes, thinking about a case he'd handled decades ago, still not sure he'd gotten it right. He felt Esther faintly, her connection still open from 8 years ago, a dim signal from the valley. She would be feeling this, he realized. Whatever she felt when the crown opened, she would be feeling it again, distantly, through the partial connection she'd never quite closed. He held all of it. He let it flow through him without grasping. The way you let water run across your palm, you receive it, you don't hold it. Then he sent the note. Not words. Words would require translation, and translation required individual interpretation, and individual interpretation would mean the signal arrived differently in every mind, and that was not what this needed to be. What he sent was simpler, a direction. The locations of the Veth relay towers, mapped in the neural geography of the signal, not described, not explained, just present, the way you can communicate where something is by pointing without speaking. Here, 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 and here. Every relay tower and network range, their positions as clear and precise as a compass bearing, with the single accompanying impulse of, these can be reached, these can be broken. The infrastructure holding the network together can be interrupted. You know where you are. You know where these are. Some of you can do something about this. That was all. Then he let go. He put the crown down on the case and he stepped back and he sat down on the floor because his legs seemed to feel that sitting down was the appropriate next thing to do. And he was aware of blood, somewhere on his face, and a high clear ringing in both ears, and the complete silence of his own individual mind, just his thoughts, just his, small and particular and his. He sat on the floor and breathed. Marin found him 6 minutes later, coming through the maintenance corridor with a shielded light. She sat down next to him on the floor without ceremony. The guards stopped moving, she said. About 4 minutes ago, they're still standing there. They're just standing. They're confused, Kale said. His voice sounded strange to him, thin, slightly far away, the way voices sound when your ears are still ringing. The network is fragmenting. They don't know what to do by themselves. They've never had to. It worked. He didn't know yet. He wouldn't know for a while, but he said, the signal went out. What people do with it is up to them. Marin was quiet for a moment. She looked at the crown in its pieces on the open case. It doesn't look like much, she said. No. You don't look like much either, she said. No offense. None taken. She was quiet again. The vault was very still. The absence of the scanner hum had been accumulating since he'd touched the crown, not an absence he'd consciously tracked, but one that now seemed enormous, like the silence after music stops and you realize you'd forgotten you were listening. What do we do now? She said. We wait, he said, and we go home. What happened next happened from many directions at once, and over a variable period of time. And it did not look like stories look when they get told afterward. A woman in a processing center in what had once been Helsinki had been watching a relay tower's power coupling for 3 years. She knew which panel covered it. She knew the torque required to pull the coupling. She had practiced the motion in her mind during every shift. When the direction arrived, not as instruction, not as order, but as pure spatial knowledge dropped suddenly into her awareness, she reached up and pulled it with her hands. Bare hands. It took 11 seconds. She was arrested within the hour which she had known would happen, which was why she had memorized her children's faces with a particular attention in the preceding weeks, committing them to a memory she intended to keep. A group of 7 people in a settlement outside what had once been Lagos had been, for 2 years, stockpiling a specific corrosive compound used in their labor assignments, draining small amounts from their weekly allotments, storing them in containers disguised as something else, under the floor of a utility room. When the signal came, they knew what they were feeling, and they knew what it meant, and they looked at each other, and they didn't need to discuss it because they had discussed it, in one form or another, for 2 years. They used the compound that morning on the base of the nearest relay tower. The tower stood for 4 hours after the corrosion was applied. Then it fell. An engineer in what had once been Seoul had spent 4 years maintaining VETH infrastructure under forced labor assignment. He had been given access to the relay towers because someone had to maintain them, and the VETH preferred not to do it themselves. He had spent 3 of those 4 years making small, untraceable modifications to the load-bearing protocols of 6 towers in his sector. Not enough to cause failure individually, not enough to be detected, but cumulative. He sent the final command on a terminal he had been authorized to use for maintenance functions, and which he had quietly extended permissions for over 3 years, in increments small enough to be attributable to administrative drift. None of them coordinated. None of them had known about each other. They had received the same direction and acted on it in the particular, stubbornly individual, multiply different way of a species that does not share consciousness, but can, when given the same information at the same moment, arrive at the same conclusion through completely different paths. The VETH relay network on Earth fragmented in 47 minutes. The VETH did not leave quickly. That would be a simpler story. The individual VETH on Earth were still alive. They were still armed. What they were not was coordinated. They responded to fragmentation, the way any organism responds to the sudden loss of a function they've never had to live without. With a confused, searching paralysis, trying to do the thing that had always worked and finding it simply wasn't working, and having no second option prepared because there had never been a need for a second option. It took, in some regions, hours. A VETH administrative garrison in what had once been Berlin simply stood still for 4 hours, until a crowd of 400 people walked up to them, unarmed, and started dismantling the garrison's equipment, at which point the VETH individuals present separated from their network, individually for the first time in their lives, made no response. Observers described them as looking lost. One account, recorded later, noted that a Veth soldier had sat down on the ground and put its face in its hands, a gesture so human that the person who witnessed it didn't know what to do with it. In other regions it took weeks. The Veth who had been in contact with the broader interstellar network at the moment of fragmentation retained more coordination, partial, degraded but functional, and those units held territory for longer. It cost lives. It cost many lives, in the blunt, specific, unglamorous way that every cost does when it's being paid by individual people in particular moments, rather than tallied in reports afterward. But it happened. Cale came back to Cairnholm. He slept for 14 hours, he ate. He sat with Sella while she updated her water table schematics, and he didn't talk, and she didn't push him to, and after a while she said, without looking up, "The communications are starting to come through, from other settlements, the ones that have radio now that the scanning interference is down." "What are they saying?" "That things are happening," she said. "A lot of things in a lot of places." "Is it enough?" She looked up then. She had the water engineer's habit of not telling people what they wanted to hear. "Ask me in 6 months," she said. He went to see Esther. She was in the corner in the deep room, but she was playing the violin, 2 hands. The left hand moved with effort. The coordination between intention and motion was labored, translated, the fingers finding their positions through concentrated will rather than trained reflex, but they were finding them. The music that came out was uneven and halting and recognizably itself. He stood in the doorway and listened until she stopped. "You felt it," he said, "when I touched it." "Yes." The still eye moved slightly, fractionally. He'd never seen it move before. The full connection came back briefly. It was very large. A pause. And then you let go and it closed, and what was left was quieter than before. The partial connection I've had since Torin, it's dimmer now. More like a memory than a presence. "Is that good?" She thought about it honestly. "It's both," she said. "I had 11 years to learn to live with what it was. Now I have to learn what it is." She looked at the violin in her hands. "But I have 2 hands again. That seems worth something." She set the bow to the strings. He left her to it. The years that followed were a different kind of story, the kind without a single clean shape, which is the kind that most actual years are. The settlements came out of the dead zones. The relay towers came down, or fell, or were dismantled, one by one and then in clusters, and then the last ones almost as an afterthought, attended to by communities that were simultaneously trying to rebuild everything else, and found administrative decommissioning of alien infrastructure somewhere in the middle of a very long list. The crown went back in the vault. Intact now, Goris had carried the 3 pieces back in a padded case, and a person whose name Cale never learned had reassembled them in the first month after Torin, working from the original schematics that had been preserved in 3 different underground archives independently and without coordination, because that was, it turned out, something humans did. The decision to return it to the vault rather than destroy it or institutionalize it had been contested. There were arguments for destroying it, the same arguments that had been made before, the ethics reports, the misuse potential. There were arguments for institutionalizing it, building governance around it, establishing authority over it. The decision that prevailed was simpler, accessible, not controlled, not weaponized, not guarded, not forbidden. Available to be used by whoever needed to use it in whatever circumstance made that necessary. The reasoning was this: the Veth were not the last threat. An empire like theirs didn't persist without addressing competition. Whatever lay beyond Earth's atmosphere was complex and various and mostly unknown, and some of it would be benign and some of it would not. And for the part that was not, what humanity had learned was that the human advantage was not speed or strength or superior weaponry. The human advantage was a species capable of synchrony without sameness, of connection without loss of self, of being alone in your own head and part of something larger at exactly the same time. That was worth keeping available. Cale was 38 the year Marin's daughter was born. The daughter was named Sella, after the water engineer, which he found quietly moving in a way he didn't bother to analyze. He held the infant at a dinner in the community center. The valley was above ground now, had been for years, the camouflage nets long since repurposed as agricultural shading. And he was aware, holding her, of the specific weight of a person who has only just arrived, who contains everything and has experienced almost nothing yet. He was in Torrens Station for the 40th anniversary of the morning in the vault, not by plan, but because he was in the area for a contact preparedness consultation. There had been 3 other species since the Veth, each more complicated than the previous assumptions about complexity had accounted for, and the contact infrastructure was a continuous work. And he had an afternoon free, and he walked through the maintenance corridor, which was full height now. Cleared and reinforced and used as a regular access passage, because the history of a thing was not a reason to not use it practically. He went down to the vault. The case was still there, the crown in it, the latch undone, the glass open. Someone came in a week to check on it, and they left the glass open because closing it implied the wrong thing about who it belonged to. He stood in front of it and looked at it. Dark alloy, small circuitry, 3 pieces fitting together into something that could, if held by a human mind patient enough to receive it without grasping, touch every other human mind on the planet at once. The most dangerous thing on Earth, and it looked like museum property. A young woman came in behind him. She was perhaps 17, with the alert, exact attention of someone who had been waiting a long time to see this room. "You're the one who picked it up," she said. "One of many," he said. "The Helsinki woman, the Lagos 7, the sole engineer." "Many others. But you were first." "Yes." She looked at the crown for a long time. "Were you scared?" He thought about it the way it deserved to be thought about. "I'd been running for 2 days," he said. "I'd lost my home, my mother, most of what I owned. I was 17 and exhausted, and I had nothing left to be afraid of losing." He paused. "That's what they don't put in the histories. Sometimes courage is just arithmetic. You run out of reasons not to try, and the only thing left is trying." She was quiet. Then the Veth called it cursed. "Yes. Because they knew what it could do. Because they knew what we could do with it," he said. "There's a difference." She looked at it a while longer. "Do you ever want to pick it up again?" He considered this honestly. "Sometimes," he said. "There's something, even for a moment, even that briefly, there's something about knowing you're not alone, that everyone is there, all of them all at once, all their small particular lives happening simultaneously." He was quiet for a moment. "It's a very human longing, I think, to be known and to know, to be part of something without disappearing into it." "Is that what we are?" she said. "To other species, the ones who want to be part of something without disappearing?" It was a real question. He gave it a real answer. "I think," he said, "we are the most frightening thing most of them have ever imagined. Not because we're strong, because we connect, and because we remain ourselves when we do it." He looked at the crown. "A species that can synchronize without surrendering individuality is either the greatest resource an empire has ever found, or the one thing it cannot afford to let survive." "The Veth chose the second option," she said. "They tried to." She nodded. She looked at the crown one last time, and he watched her face as she looked, the specific face of someone encountering the real version of something they've known as legend, the adjustment between scale of story and scale of object, the recalibration that happens when the thing that changed everything turns out to be small and dark and unheroic looking. "It's not cursed," she said. "No," he said. "It never was." He turned and walked back through the corridor, through 40 years of history embedded in the walls of it, through the maintenance passage that was now just a passage, into the ordinary afternoon, into the specific, unglamorous, continuing work of a species that had been told it was not enough and had turned out to be exactly enough at exactly the moment it was needed. Behind him in the vault the crown sat in its case, the latch undone, the glass open to the air, waiting the way it had always waited, for the next hand willing to reach.